Hello class, today's lesson is going to be on phrases and clauses. This lesson builds off of our previous lesson on prepositions, subjects, and verbs, and the different parts of speech. So I recommend watching that and trying that lesson first before you watch this one. Again, the goal of these lessons is not to constrain you by a ton of rules, but to help give you some freedom to edit and play with your sentences so that hopefully the writing process goes a little bit more smoothly, a little bit easier, and you can have, even more control of how you express yourself. So, phrases and clauses, first we need to know, just in a nutshell, what are they? So phrases are groups of words that cannot be a complete sentence by themselves. Phrases do not contain a subject or a verb. So if you think of your prepositions, remember prepositions can never be the subject of a sentence, and they don't contain a subject or verb inside of them. And really, most importantly, they don't contain a verb, because they might contain a noun, but a noun isn't a subject unless it has a verb. Clauses, on the other hand, clauses are groups of words that can sometimes stand alone as a complete sentence by themselves. And they do contain a subject and a verb. And again, just as a quick tip, the verb is key. Why is this important? Well, understanding the differences between phrases and clauses allows us to be able to choose which one we want to use depending on what our goal is. Do we want a long sentence? Do we want a short sentence? Do we want our ideas close together? Or do we want our ideas apart? So you can even sometimes take an entire sentence and rewrite it and express it as just a short phrase attached to another sentence. And so which one do we choose? Well, a lot of it comes down to personal choice and style, and sometimes it might come down to how much space you have to write. So, in some job applications, you only get a certain number of characters or words, and so understanding how to condense and maximally adjust your language can be a huge advantage in a digital age. All right, so here are some examples. In the first example, we're going to see the same idea expressed as both a phrase and a clause. So the first example shows, before class, I ate breakfast. Okay, and so the prepositional phrase is before class. Notice whenever you have a phrase or clause at the beginning of a sentence, you will always see it accompanied by a comma directly after. In the next example, we see the same idea represented as a clause, meaning it has a subject and a verb. So it says, before I go to class, I eat breakfast. So in that clause, I is the subject and go is the verb. Okay, so in example 2, again, I'm trying to express the same idea as a phrase and a clause. This time I put the examples at the end of the sentence to show that they can be either at the beginning or at the end. And you'll notice that when a phrase or clause it comes at the end of a sentence, there's no comma that is needed. So we ate dinner after the movie. That's an example of a phrase. And the second example, we ate dinner after the movie ended. You'll notice that only one word has changed. In fact, one word was added, the word ended. So adding the verb ended has now made the movie a subject. So again, nouns can be subjects, but they have to have verbs in order to be subjects. So the word ended changed the clause into a clause. Okay, so there are two types of clauses, and really there are more than that, but I want to think of like two main types. And so the main types are independent clauses, which are also called main clauses, and these can stand alone as complete sentences. And so here's an example. John and Sarah fought over a pair of black gloves. Okay, so they both have, so there's a subject and verb. The subject's John and Sarah, and the verb is fought. And then we have dependent clauses, or often called subordinate clauses. These clauses cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. So here, I've taken the same clause and I just added the word after. So after John and Sarah fought over a pair of black gloves, comma, ... So this begs us to ask the question, well, okay, so what happened after they fought over the pair of black gloves? So the sentence is no longer complete, so now we have to add more to the sentence to complete it. So that's one example of a dependent clause. And so I want to add a quick note. You can even break this down further, and you can learn about the different types of dependent clauses. And so there are 3 types of dependent clauses, and those include adverb clauses, adjective clauses, and noun clauses. So dependent words and subordinate conjunctions, the way you can identify a dependent clause is not just by reading it and seeing if it sounds complete or doesn't, but an easier way is to look at the first word of the clause. So dependent clauses begin with specific words that signal that it's a dependent clause, much in the same way a prepositional phrase has a prepositional word at the beginning. If we remove the dependent clause, we are often left with a normal independent clause. And so you'll notice in the example below, since everyone should learn an instrument, comma, ... the word since makes it dependent. If we remove the word in the second example and we just leave everyone should learn an instrument, this is actually a perfectly good complete sentence all on its own. Okay, so here is a list of some subordinating conjunctions for your adverb dependent clauses. And you'll notice that some of them are blue. I've tried to notate some of the ones that are also prepositional words as well. And so you'll have to remember to look to see if you see a subject and a verb. If you see a subject and verb, then you know it is an adverb clause and not a preposition. So I recommend printing this out. I'll link to a practice cheat sheet that has a list of these subordinating words. Okay, so here are some examples of adverb clauses. Remember, adverb clauses can be at the beginning, middle, or at the end of a sentence. In the first example, because I like the Lakers, I watch every Laker game. So the adverb clause is because I like the Lakers. Notice again, if you had removed the first word, because, and just left I like the Lakers, you would be left with an independent clause. And then we'd have a comma splice though, so we want to leave the because there. You can also take the same sentence and the same clause, just take the clause and move it to the end. I watch every Laker game because I like the Lakers. You'll notice that when the adverb clause is at the beginning of a sentence, you use a comma, but when the adverb clause is at the end of a sentence, you do not need a comma. And so in fact, you'll never really see a comma before a because clause right at the end of a sentence. And if you do, it's just a very common mistake that I see. Okay, in the third example, this one I intended to be pretty funny. So we have a dependent clause, a long dependent clause in the middle of the sentence. So the independent clause is the best thing to do is to make yourself a good strong cup of tea. And the dependent clause is when you have a dead body on the kitchen floor and don't know what to do about it. And this is very common. You'll see that you can use dependent clauses as interrupters in the middle of an independent clause, but after the subject and before the verb, to add some additional thoughts and ideas to make the sentence a little bit more lively. And then one more side note, again, you can have many or multiple dependent clauses in a sentence. You can't quite do the same with independent clauses unless you follow a few rules, which we'll learn about in a future lesson. Okay, so then we learned about adverb clauses. Now let's take a second to look at adjective clauses. Adjective clauses appear after a noun, and like their names imply, they function pretty much like adjectives. So they describe a noun, and they always begin with specific words called relative pronouns. There aren't as many relative pronouns, fortunately, to remember. So the important ones here are that, which is sometimes implied. In fact, it's the only one, that is the only pronoun that is sometimes implied, meaning you don't have to always put it in the sentence. Which, who, whom, whose, which, where, when, what, and why. Okay? And so any of these words can begin what's called an adjective clause. So I've given 3 examples below. You'll notice in the first example we have people who play instruments are cooler than those who don't. Okay, so the adjective clause is people who play instruments, and you'll notice it comes after the noun people. One other quick thing that you want to note is that the relative pronoun who is also the subject of the clause. And that's really common with adjective clauses, where the pronoun that begins the adjective clause is also the subject. And then we have a second adjective clause, which comes after the word those, and that's who don't, which I have in orange. We can have multiple adjective clauses in a sentence. And again, the relative pronoun who is the subject of the clause. In the next example, I repeated this example twice to show the implied that, which can be left out of the sentence. So in the second example here, we have the library did not have the book that I wanted. You could just leave the that out if you choose. And we could have written it as is shown in the third example, the library did not have the book I wanted. So it's still an adjective clause, it's just that the that is implied. And another quick tip, whenever you have a that clause, you'll never put commas around it. Okay, so now, noun clauses look very similar to adjective clauses. they begin with many of the same words, but they also function as nouns. So that's the key difference. Adjective clauses function as adjectives. Noun clauses function as nouns. And they can appear at the beginning of a sentence, though adjective clauses can't. So in the first example, the noun clause is what you say, and the entire clause is the subject of the sentence, what you say is true. So that entire clause functions as a noun, which is a subject. In the second example, I don't know where he went. In this example, the noun clause functions as the object of the sentence. And in the third example, why she likes salt in her coffee is beyond me. This is almost identical to the first example here, where the clause, why she likes salt in her coffee, is the subject of the verb is, and is the subject of the independent clause, which is the whole sentence. Okay, so there are 5 types of phrases that I really want you to know, and there are other phrases that we'll learn about in the future, but these are sort of the main ones that you need to know right now. And the most important thing to remember is that phrases don't have subjects and verbs, and really the key word there is a verb, because they might have a noun inside of the phrase. Many phrases will end with a noun, but the noun can't be a subject without a verb. And the other key tip here, which I wrote at the bottom, is to always look at the first word. The first word helps you identify exactly which type of phrase is. So first you ask, is there a subject or a verb? And then you look at the first word. So we learned about prepositions in the last lesson. And so if you recall, prepositions always begin with a specific prepositional word and end in a noun. And you can find a list in the link below the video of this assignment. Then we learned last time also about infinitives. So infinitives always begin with the word to and are followed by a verb. And so infinitives can be tricky because they can look like a preposition. Some prepositions, like I am going to Disneyland, the prepositional phrase being to Disneyland, look like infinitives because they also begin with the word to, but the key is to look for to plus the verb at the end. The third type of phrase I want you to learn about today is called a present participle phrase. The present participle phrase always begins with the first word that ends in ing. And this one can also be tricky because sometimes ing words might look like verbs. But remember, in our first lesson, we learned that in order for an ing word to be a verb, it has to have a helping verb in front of it. And the fourth type of phrase I want you to learn about today is called a past participle phrase. And this one's very similar to the present participle phrase. Again, it contains a word that is not the verb in the sentence, and you just look at the first word to see what it ends in. And so the first word of a past participle phrase typically ends in ed, en, n, or ne. And then lastly, I want you to learn about what are called appositive phrases. And we've actually practiced appositive phrases in the class before. These are noun restatements. And so we often use these when we're introducing our sources. So when we say, according to Michelle Alexander, comma, then we follow with a noun restatement. A renowned scholar known for her work on race and mass incarceration, comma. So that restatement, usually surrounded by commas, that is what's called an appositive phrase. So you're actually pretty familiar and have practiced this before. Okay, so let's practice a little bit. So in this first example, I have a sentence here. So it's Lawrence Cross, comma, founder of the Origins Project at Arizona State University, comma, recently published an article about teaching doubt to young students. So based on what you see here in purple, what type of phrase or clause is this? So you see if you can pause the video and figure out for yourself. Okay, so the first step, if you haven't figured it out yet, is to ask, is there a subject and a verb? And so there isn't a subject and a verb here. So founder of the Origins Project at Arizona State University, there's no verb there, so there can't be a subject either. Okay, so then we can conclude that if there's no subject and verb, then it must be a phrase. So we look at the first word. So does it begin with a preposition? So is founder one of those prepositional words? I do see of there, but I'm looking at the first word. So it doesn't appear that the first word is one of those prepositional words. Infinitive. Does it begin with the word to, followed by a verb? Founder doesn't appear to be the word to, so that one's pretty easy. So it's not an infinitive. Present participle phrase. Does the first word end in ing? So again, I don't see an ing there, so I can determine that it's not a present participle phrase. Past participle phrase. Does it end in the word ed? We have an er there. It looks very similar, but it doesn't appear to be a past participle phrase. So lastly, it must be in a positive. And does it restate the noun? Yes. Founder of the Origins Project at Arizona State University describes or restates who Lawrence Krauss is. And so there we go. We've found the answer. So let's try another one. Okay, so in this practice, we have the following sentence. Removing his shoes, Jack slowly proceeded towards Rose as she leaned over the side of the boat. So I've highlighted in purple as she leaned over the side of the boat. And so I'm looking at the first, where this phrase or clause begins. So pause the video and see if you can figure it out for yourself first. Okay, so if you haven't figured it out yet, you first want to ask, well, does it have a subject and a verb? And the answer is yes, it does. We have she is the subject and leaned is the verb. So we have a subject and a verb. So therefore we know it must be a clause. So let's check the first word. Does the first word make it dependent? So we have as she leaned over the side of the boat. That sounds like it is pretty dependent. It makes me wonder, well, what happened as she leaned over the side of the boat? And a quick tip is to sometimes take the first word off. So if we took off the word as and just looked at she leaned over the side of the boat, that sounds like it could be a complete sentence by itself. So if the first word makes it sound less complete, then that's a pretty good indicator that it's one of those dependent words. And indeed it is. So yes, the word as is a dependent word. So this is a dependent clause. And even more specifically, if you want to challenge yourself, is you want to figure out what type of dependent clause it is. This is an adverb clause. Okay, so that's it for today's lesson. I hope that this lesson was helpful.